It happened in less than 7 seconds. At the edge of a crowded electronics market in Dubai, a fragile girl in a torn school uniform stood trembling as a towering security guard held her by the wrist. In front of them, a billionaire in an impeccably white kandura watched silently, the glow of the newest iPhone reflecting off his cold, expressionless face. The phone's alarm had gone off the moment she picked it up. Accidentally, she insisted, but no one cared about her explanation. The guard accused her loudly. People filmed everything, and the billionaire finally stepped forward, lowering his sunglasses just enough to reveal a stare sharp enough to cut through bone. With a voice barely above a whisper, he made an offer that froze the entire street. "You want this phone? Then you'll do something for me, something only you can do." The crowd gasped, and in that humiliating moment, the girl realized this wasn't about the phone anymore. It was about power. Mira had grown up in the narrow back alleys behind Dubai's glittering skyline, where the scent of spices mixed with the metallic tang of construction dust and opportunity rarely reached the ground. Every morning before school, she swept the tiny one-room apartment she shared with her mother and younger brother, careful not to wake them as she prepared their breakfast from whatever leftovers she could stretch into a meal. She dreamed of studying technology, building apps, and one day creating something that would lift her family out of the constant fear of eviction. But reality kept dragging her back. Her mother worked 2 cleaning jobs, her brother had asthma they could barely afford to treat, and Mira's school fees were already 3 months overdue. Despite all of this, Mira carried a quiet talent nobody seemed to notice. She could look at a broken phone and understand it the way some people read a face, intuitively, instantly. Old phones given up as trash, circuits fried by heat, screens shattered by careless hands. She revived them all using improvised tools, patience, and a mind sharp enough to spot flaws invisible to most adults. But because she was young, poor, and invisible to the world, her skill was dismissed as luck. Nobody took her seriously, and no store wanted to give a street kid a chance, even though she could repair devices faster than half the trained technicians. Still, she kept trying. Every afternoon after school, she'd walk past the beautiful luxury electronics stores she couldn't enter, watching tourists buy devices worth more than her family's monthly rent. She didn't envy their wealth. She envied the possibilities it represented. And deep down, she believed that if she could just get her hands on better tools, maybe even a modern phone to study, she could change everything. But life had a way of reminding her that dreams were expensive, and Mira was broke. Khalid Al-Rami was the kind of man whose name alone made investors straighten their backs and competitors swallow hard. Born into one of the wealthiest families in Dubai, he had transformed his inheritance into a technological empire that stretched from luxury smart devices to encrypted data networks used by governments around the world. His presence carried an almost gravitational weight. People moved when he moved, hushed when he entered, and watched him the way one watches a storm forming over calm water. Everything about him radiated precision. The pristine white kandura pressed to perfection, the silver cufflinks engraved with his family crest, the silent bodyguards who walked 2 steps behind him as if choreographed since birth. He was power-made flesh, a man whose decisions reshaped markets within minutes. But behind that immaculate exterior, Khalid was known for something else, something colder. He had a reputation for eliminating problems with a level of efficiency that bordered on brutality, never raising his voice, never losing control, never allowing emotion to interfere with business. Employees whispered stories of colleagues who made a single mistake and vanished from the company overnight. Vendors once trusted by his family now lived in fear of crossing him. And though his business dealt with technology, his true influence came from something far more dangerous: information. He collected it, guarded it, weaponized it. To most people, crossing Khalid Al-Rami meant risking not just their livelihood, but their future. That morning, he had visited the electronics market not for pleasure, but to quietly inspect a distribution issue his company was having. Surrounded by merchants desperate to impress him, he walked with the detached curiosity of a king touring a kingdom built beneath his feet. And that was when he saw her, a poor girl with trembling hands holding the newest iPhone, the store alarm blaring, the crowd forming like vultures around a wounded creature. Khalid paused, the scene reflecting in his dark lenses, calculating silently. There was something about the moment, its chaos, its vulnerability, that caught his attention. Not because he cared, but because he sensed opportunity in places others saw inconvenience. And this girl, small and terrified before him, had just become part of his plans. The accusations spread through the market like fire chasing dry grass. Within seconds, phones were pointed at Mira from every direction, capturing her trembling voice as she tried to explain that she hadn't stolen anything, that the alarm had gone off because the device was defective, that she had only picked it up to inspect the malfunction. But no one listened. The security guard tightened his grip on her wrist, twisting it slightly as he pulled her closer, announcing loudly that thieves were getting younger and bolder every year. The words struck her harder than his hand ever could. She felt her cheeks burn beneath the weight of dozens of judgmental stares, each one branding her with the same cruel assumption: poor means criminal. Khalid stepped forward, and the crowd parted as if obeying an unspoken command. His presence silenced even the guard, who straightened immediately, suddenly aware of the power standing in front of him. Mira looked up at the billionaire's expressionless face, praying he would believe her, that he would ask a question, inspect the phone, give her the barest chance to defend herself. But he didn't. Instead, he picked up the iPhone from the guard's hand, studied it, and allowed a faint, dismissive smile to curve at the corner of his mouth. "So," he said softly, almost gently, "your plan was to steal one of the most sophisticated security tag devices in the country?" His tone carried no anger, only amusement, the cruel kind reserved for someone who thinks they're smarter than a child. The crowd murmured, and Mira's throat tightened so painfully she thought she might choke. She knew this wasn't fair. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here she stood, painted as a thief before a man whose influence could crush her future in a single sentence. And then came the moment that broke her. The security guard forced her to her knees, shoving her bag onto the floor as merchants and tourists filmed with hungry curiosity. In that instant, all Mira could feel was despair, humiliation wrapping around her like a cold hand. And as tears gathered in her eyes, she saw Khalid watching her with that same quiet, unreadable expression, as if measuring the extent of her helplessness, as if deciding what to do with it. As the guard rifled through her bag, scattering her notebooks and the tiny screwdriver kit she always carried, something inside Mira snapped, not in rage, but in clarity. She noticed a faint blinking pattern inside the iPhone's side port, a rhythm most people would ignore, but one she instantly recognized. It wasn't the theft alarm at all. It was a diagnostic loop error, a rare glitch caused by a misaligned sensor in the model's new thermal chip. The phone had triggered itself, and she realized in that moment that the only person who could prove her innocence was herself. She took a breath, steadying the tremble in her fingers, and reached out toward the device still in Khalid's hand. The guard yanked her back brutally, but Khalid raised a single finger, signaling him to stop. The billionaire didn't speak. He simply studied her, intrigued by the sudden shift in her expression. Mira swallowed hard, then pointed at the blinking port and said, voice barely above a whisper, "This phone isn't stolen. The alarm wasn't triggered by me. The thermal sensor is defective." The crowd chuckled. The guard scoffed, but Khalid did not. Mira continued, trading humiliation for precision, her mind moving faster than her fear. "If you tilt it by exactly 30 degrees and tap the lower edge, the alarm will reset. The diagnostic light never lies." And for a moment, just a single breath of time, she stopped trembling. Khalid turned the phone slowly, executing the motion exactly as she described. The air thickened around them as the beeping abruptly stopped. Clean, final, undeniable. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Mira didn't smile, didn't stand, didn't celebrate. She simply lowered her eyes, knowing she had just done the impossible. She had made a billionaire listen. Khalid's face didn't show disappointment or satisfaction. Instead, it revealed something far more dangerous: interest. It was the quiet look of a man who had just discovered a tool he didn't know he needed. And though she didn't realize it yet, Mira's revelation, small, brilliant, desperate, had shifted the balance between them for the first time. But the world doesn't forgive the poor just because they're right. The silence that followed the alarm's reset lasted only a heartbeat before the guard, desperate to save face, declared loudly that Mira must have tampered with the device earlier, twisting the narrative to protect his pride. Merchants nodded, eager to agree with the uniform rather than the girl on her knees. And even though Khalid knew the truth, had witnessed it himself, he didn't defend her. He simply handed the phone back to the store manager, murmured something too soft to be heard, and began to walk away, leaving Mira surrounded by the same hostile eyes that had judged her moments earlier. She felt the fragile moment of dignity she'd reclaimed slip through her fingers, replaced by a hollow ache in her chest. The store manager, embarrassed that he had almost accused a paying customer by mistake, redirected the blame toward the easiest target, Mira. With a cold, clipped tone, he told her she was banned from the market indefinitely, that her presence caused disturbances. The guard shoved her bag against her chest and told her not to return, unless she wanted the police involved. Mira tried to argue, to remind them she had proven her innocence, but the words hit the air and fell dead. No one cared. In their eyes, she was still a problem, and problems were easier to discard than understand. She gathered her scattered notebooks and tools with shaking hands, each motion carving humiliation deeper into her ribs. By the time she stepped outside, the heat of the Dubai sun felt heavier than usual, pressing against her shoulders, as if the world itself wanted her to collapse. People passed without looking at her, the crowd having already moved on to fresher spectacles. Mira walked to a quiet alley and sat on a crate, hugging her bag to her chest, while the sting of injustice settled like dust on her skin. She had saved herself from a false accusation, yet still lost everything. Her place in the market, her chance to work with discarded electronics, the only space where she could practice the skill that gave her hope. It was supposed to be over, but what she didn't know was that her fall had not gone unnoticed, and the man whose silence had wounded her most was not done with her. Mira was still sitting in the shade of the narrow alley when she heard footsteps approaching, not heavy like the guards, not hurried like the merchants, but slow, deliberate, and uncomfortably familiar. She didn't look up at first. She didn't want to. Her chest still ached from the weight of humiliation, and the last person she expected or wanted to see was the man whose silence had allowed that humiliation to deepen. But when a shadow fell over her knees, she lifted her head just enough to see the polished white hem of a kandura and a pair of expensive leather sandals. Her heartbeat stuttered. Khalid al-Rami stood in front of her, alone this time, his bodyguards waiting several meters away, as if he'd ordered them to keep their distance. His expression was unreadable, carved from the same quiet stone as earlier, but now there was something different in his eyes, calculation mixed with something almost like curiosity. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Mira lowered her gaze, expecting a reprimand, perhaps even a threat disguised as advice. Instead, Khalid broke the silence with a question so unexpected it pulled her eyes back to his. "How did you know?" he asked. No preamble. No judgment, just the question, heavy with intent. Mira hesitated, unsure whether he was mocking her or testing her, but his posture, hands clasped behind his back, head slightly tilted, suggested genuine interest. She explained in cautious detail the blinking pattern, the diagnostic loop, the thermal sensor flaw she had studied in older models. And as she spoke, Khalid listened with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, the kind of listening that suggested he wasn't merely hearing her, he was evaluating her. Then, without warning, he extended a small metallic card toward her, its surface engraved with his company's emblem. "Come to this address," he said, voice low but absolute. "Tomorrow, 8 in the morning." Mira stared at the card as though it might burn her fingertips. She didn't understand why he wanted to see her, what he expected, or how someone like her could possibly matter to someone like him. "Why?" she managed to whisper. Khalid didn't blink. "Because," he said, "there's something only you can do." With that, he turned and walked away, his figure dissolving into the sunlit chaos of the market. Mira remained frozen, the card trembling in her hand, realizing that the moment she feared most, the moment she thought she was free from, had only just begun. The lobby of Al-Rami Technologies felt less like a building and more like a boundary between worlds, one of glass, steel, and quiet money. When Mira stepped inside the next morning, her worn shoes squeaked against the polished marble floor, drawing discreet glances. From receptionists dressed in tailored uniforms, she clutched her small bag to her chest, painfully aware that she didn't belong here. Yet she followed the directions on the card, moving toward a private elevator guarded by a man who scanned her, hesitated, then silently pressed a button after confirming Khalid's authorization. The doors closed around her with a hiss, sealing her inside a rising chamber that reflected her anxious face on every metallic surface. As the elevator climbed, Mira's pulse pounded in her throat. She didn't know what awaited her at the top, an opportunity, a trap, or something far more complicated. But the only way out was forward. When the doors opened, she stepped into a vast office wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Khalid stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, as he gazed at the skyline, like a man observing a kingdom he didn't rule, but owned. He spoke without turning. "You're late." Mira froze. She was exactly on time. Before she could explain, he pivoted slowly, as if measuring her reaction to the unfair accusation. But this time she didn't lower her head. She inhaled carefully and said, "The elevator was restricted. I came as quickly as they allowed." Khalid studied her for several seconds, then gave a barely perceptible nod, an acknowledgement disguised as nothing at all. He motioned toward a long table filled with phones, tablets, and advanced prototypes covered with security seals. "These devices are failing," he said. "Every engineer I hired has misdiagnosed the root cause." He walked closer, his voice dropping until it felt like the room itself was leaning in to hear. "But yesterday, you saw something no one else did, something everyone else missed." His eyes locked onto hers, cold, steady, and unnervingly focused. "I need that ability." Mira's heart hammered, not from fear but from disbelief. Khalid Al-Rami, a billionaire surrounded by experts from every corner of the world, was telling her, a girl banned from the marketplace, that he needed her mind. He continued, "There is a systemic flaw jeopardizing an upcoming launch, a flaw hidden so deeply that my engineers treat it as random malfunction. But it isn't. There's a pattern." Then he stepped even closer, and for the first time, she saw something fragile beneath the iron control in his expression. "Urgency. Find it," he said, "and I'll make it worth your time." Mira exhaled, slowly, realizing that the impossible had happened. The man who could destroy her with a word needed her to save him. For a moment, Mira stood completely still, the words, "I need that ability," echoing in her mind like a distant bell. She had never been needed before, not by someone powerful, not by someone who could change the direction of her life with a single decision. But as the initial shock faded, something else rose quietly inside her. The memory of yesterday's humiliation, the sting of being dragged through a crowd and branded a thief simply because she was poor. She looked at Khalid, not with fear this time, but with a measured resolve she didn't know she possessed. If he truly needed her, then she would not enter this arrangement as a desperate girl begging for a chance. She would enter as someone who deserved respect, someone who could walk away. She stepped closer to the table of malfunctioning devices, running her fingers lightly above them without touching, observing the faint diagnostic lights as though reading lines of code written in the air. Then she looked up at Khalid and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "If I help you," she said, "I want 3 things." Khalid raised an eyebrow, not in annoyance, but in interest. He had expected fear, gratitude, maybe even silence, but not conditions. Mira continued, "First, no one treats me like they did yesterday. No guards, no shouting, no assumptions. I won't work for someone who thinks I'm a criminal." Khalid didn't respond, but his expression tightened slightly, the only sign that the memory of the marketplace bothered him more than he let on. "Second," she added, I work alone. No engineers breathing over my shoulder trying to claim what I find. She hesitated before delivering the third condition, the most daring one, the one that took all the courage she had left. And third, I want to be paid fairly, not in promises, not in favors, in money. She lifted her chin. Enough to pay my school fees, enough so my family doesn't get evicted. There was no tremor in her voice, no apology. Just truth. For several long seconds, Khalid said nothing. He simply observed her the way a strategist studies a new opponent, curious, analytical, almost impressed. Finally, he spoke in a low, controlled tone. You negotiate boldly for someone with nothing. Mira met his gaze without flinching. That's exactly why I have to. A single, unexpected smile ghosted across his lips, not warm, not gentle, but acknowledging. Very well, he said. Your conditions are accepted. And in that single moment, the balance between them shifted once again, not in power, but in dignity. Mira was escorted, not by guards this time, but by a quiet assistant, into a private lab deep inside the building. The room was unlike anything she had ever seen. Walls lined with translucent screens, tables filled with prototype devices, and shelves packed with diagnostic tools so advanced they looked like they belonged in a science fiction film. She hesitated at the threshold, overwhelmed by the sheer sophistication of everything around her, and then, slowly, she stepped inside. The lab door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing her in a world of possibilities she had only dreamed of. For the first time in her life, Mira wasn't just repairing old, discarded technology. She was standing at the center of innovation, surrounded by the very machines she had spent years studying from afar. She set her bag on the table and opened it with careful hands, revealing her tiny screwdriver kit, rusted, mismatched, rescued from junk piles. It looked pitiful next to the gleaming equipment the lab provided, yet she arranged it beside the tools with quiet pride. They were symbols of where she came from, of how far her mind had carried her despite the limits around her. Within hours, she immersed herself in work, analyzing failure logs, comparing internal temperature data, mapping anomalous energy spikes across multiple devices, and as she worked, something remarkable happened. The lab adapted to her. Systems calibrated to her movements, screens lit up in response to her commands, and the complicated environment that should have intimidated her instead flowed around her like an extension of her own thoughts. It was as if, for the first time, her intellect had room to breathe. Day after day, Mira returned, arriving earlier than requested and leaving long after the building emptied. She studied, learned, experimented. Her posture changed, her steps grew firmer, her voice steadier. The timid girl who had once been dragged across a marketplace began to disappear, replaced by someone sharper, someone who understood her worth. Even her clothes changed. Khalid instructed an assistant to provide her with practical attire suitable for lab work, and though she hesitated to accept it, she wore it with quiet confidence. With each passing hour, she rose, not because someone handed her power, but because she earned it with every insight, every connection, every small revelation that brought her closer to the truth behind the device's failures. She was ascending layer by layer, and even Khalid noticed the transformation. Though he rarely visited the lab, whenever he passed by the glass wall, he paused for a moment longer than necessary, watching the girl he had underestimated become the asset he couldn't ignore. 2 weeks later, Mira found herself standing before a pair of towering doors made of reinforced glass and polished steel, the entrance to the executive auditorium of Al Rami Technologies. Inside, the company's top engineers, investors, and international partners were gathered for a private emergency summit. Their upcoming product launch, valued at billions, hung by a thread because of the mysterious malfunction that had escaped every expert's understanding. This room was not merely a conference hall, it was an arena where reputations were forged or destroyed in a heartbeat. Mira swallowed hard, fingers gripping the strap of her bag, and took a step forward. The doors opened automatically, revealing a semicircular chamber filled with sharply dressed professionals who all turned their eyes toward her, confusion tightening their expressions. A security badge printed with her name flashed on her chest, small but powerful enough to silence anyone who questioned her presence. Khalid stood at the center of the room, beside a long glass table lined with malfunctioning prototypes, speaking to the board in a calm voice that barely disguised the urgency beneath it. When he saw Mira enter, he lifted a hand, signaling her to come forward. The room shifted. Engineers whispered to one another, investors frowned, and the lead technical director, a man named Faisal, narrowed his eyes in irritation. Mira walked toward the table, conscious of every judgmental stare following her. She felt the weight of expectation, doubt, and resentment stacking on her shoulders, but she stood taller than she ever had before. Khalid stepped aside, allowing her to approach the devices. "This is the girl I told you about," he announced, his tone firm. "She found patterns none of you did." A ripple of disbelief rolled through the room. Faisal scoffed audibly. "She's a child," he muttered. Khalid didn't look at him, but the room sensed the warning simmering beneath the billionaire's silence. Mira placed her hands on the table, steadying herself as dozens of eyes bore into her. She inhaled deeply, then spoke, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the tension. "You've all been searching for a hardware failure," she said, "but the problem was never the hardware." The murmurs stopped. Screens activated around the room as she projected the data she had spent days analyzing, mapping the precise moments when the devices overheated, glitched, or triggered false alarms. "There is a single micro-interruption in the power distribution matrix," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "It occurs only when 3 specific features activate simultaneously. It's rare, but predictable and fixable." The engineers leaned forward, skeptical but intrigued. Mira tapped a sequence onto the glass table, triggering a simulation that displayed the hidden pattern with perfect clarity. Gasps filled the room. Investors exchanged stunned glances, and in that moment, as lights reflected off her determined face, Mira realized she wasn't just presenting a solution. She was proving that she belonged in the arena every person here assumed she could never enter. But in every arena where truth threatens pride, an enemy waits in silence. As the room absorbed Mira's findings, a flicker of resentment ignited across the face of Faisal, the lead technical director, the man who had spent months insisting the failure was random, the man whose reputation now trembled before a girl he had dismissed without a second glance. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists hidden behind his tablet, and his gaze sharpened with a bitterness Mira didn't yet recognize as danger. Every word she spoke, every nod of impressed approval from the board, every moment Khalid allowed her to stand in the spotlight carved deeper into his ego. In Faisal's mind, she wasn't a prodigy. She was a threat, one that had humiliated him in front of the most powerful people in the company. And threats, he believed, needed to be eliminated quietly. He waited for the perfect opening. Then, just as Mira prepared to demonstrate the override patch she had created, Faisal stepped forward with a calculated calmness, masking deception behind a veneer of professionalism. He cleared his throat loudly enough to regain the room's attention. "Before we put the company's future in the hands of an untrained outsider," he said, emphasizing the last words, "we should verify her conclusions using proper protocol." His tone dripped with condescension, disguised as caution. Several board members shifted uncertainly, caught between Khalid's endorsement and Faisal's authority. Mira felt the shift instantly, the atmosphere tightening, suspicion blooming like poison in the air. She opened her mouth to respond, but Faisal continued, overriding her with a smoothness born of years, manipulating rooms like this. He tapped a few commands into the table's interface, pulling up a conflicting set of diagnostic results, the same flawed data he had been using for months to defend his theories. But something about the numbers felt wrong, too clean, too perfectly aligned to make her look mistaken. That was when Mira noticed it, a single anomaly buried deep in the logs, a timestamp that didn't match the device's internal clock. A falsified entry, a deliberate alteration. Her pulse quickened. Faisal wasn't just disagreeing with her, he was sabotaging her, attempting to discredit her in front of the entire board before she could reveal the truth. And as he turned to the executives with a confident smile, pretending to expose her error, Mira realized with chilling clarity, the real enemy in this room wasn't the malfunctioning technology. It was the man determined to bury her brilliance to save his pride. Mira forced herself to breathe as the room shifted, the board members leaning toward Faisal's falsified data like moths drawn to a flame. His numbers looked convincing, deceptively polished, aligned with the conclusions he had been repeating for weeks. But Mira had spent countless hours studying the real data. She knew its rhythm, its inconsistencies, its hidden pulse, and this perfect chart Faisal had presented wasn't real. She stepped closer to the holographic projection, eyes narrowing, scanning for the faint irregularities she knew must be there. Then she saw it, one single timestamp in the lower right quadrant, seemingly insignificant but glaringly impossible for anyone who understood system architecture. The device log showed an internal activity at 03:12:58, yet the device's automated cycle had been offline at that exact second. It could not have recorded anything. It was a ghost entry, planted manually. Her mind raced through the implications. The only way that timestamp could exist was if someone intentionally altered the diagnostic logs to support a false conclusion. Someone with high-level access. Someone desperate to protect their ego. She felt heat rising in her chest, not anger, but clarity. Faisal had sabotaged the data to hide his incompetence, and if she didn't expose it carefully, the entire room would turn against her. She lifted her hand slowly, letting her fingers glide through the holographic projection, isolating the timestamp. "This entry," she said, her voice steady but sharpened by precision, "should not exist." The room quieted instantly, their attention snapping back to her. Khalid's expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, his eyes narrowing in interest, in recognition that something important was unfolding. Faisal let out a forced laugh, stepping forward with the confidence of a man who believed his deceit untouchable. "You're misreading the logs," he said. "These entries are automated. They cannot be edited by anyone." He stopped. Mira had expanded the lone timestamp, magnifying the metadata behind it. The room leaned in as the projection revealed a hidden audit trail, one that displayed the ID of the user who had accessed the file at 03:13:02, the very moment the false entry had been inserted. The name glowed in the air like a spotlight cutting through fog. Faisal Haddad, admin level 4. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Faisal's face drained of color as the truth settled over the board like a storm cloud. Mira didn't need to accuse him. She didn't need to raise her voice or defend herself. The fraud had revealed itself through the one thing he couldn't manipulate, the system's shadow record of his own actions. The room froze, tension crystallizing in the air like a pane of glass ready to shatter. Faisal stared at the glowing audit trail hovering above the table, his mouth opening but producing no sound, just a strangled exhale of disbelief. The board members whispered among themselves, their faces tightening with the realization that they had been misled for weeks by the very man they trusted to maintain the company's technological integrity. But Mira didn't move. She knew that exposing the timestamp wasn't enough. Faisal was experienced in navigating corporate storms. He would search for excuses, loopholes, ways to twist the situation into a misunderstanding. If she didn't corner him completely, trap him with his own arrogance, he would slip free and redirect the blame toward her. She needed him to incriminate himself publicly, irreversibly, so she took a single step back, lowering her eyes just slightly, allowing uncertainty to color her voice. "Maybe I am misreading it," she murmured. "Maybe you can explain this entry better than I can." She gestured toward the projection, inviting him forward. It was a deliberate act of humility, a false retreat to bait the trap. Faisal seized the opening immediately, desperate to regain control. He marched toward the hologram, jaw tightening, hands trembling just enough to betray his panic. "This is nothing," he snapped. "A system hiccup, a misconfiguration. Anyone with basic training knows these logs can malfunction." He tapped the projection rapidly, cycling through screens, trying to bury the incriminating audit trail beneath layers of data. "The system creates shadow entries all the time," he insisted. "It doesn't mean—" He cut himself off. But it was too late. Mira had been waiting for that sentence. She raised her gaze, eyes meeting Khalid's for a brief, silent second. Permission granted. Then she extended her hand and tapped a control panel embedded in the table, activating a hidden feature she had discovered during her long nights in the lab: live terminal auditing. The hologram shifted, replacing the static logs with a real-time view of the system, including a stream of every active user action. And there, highlighted in bright red for the entire room to see, was the current entry being generated by the device. Admin Level 4. Manual log override attempt. Faisal froze, his finger still hovering over the projection. The board members gasped. Khalid took a single step forward, his expression carved from ice. Mira didn't speak. She didn't need to. The room had just witnessed Faisal attempting to alter the logs again, in real time, right in front of the executives, proving his guilt beyond dispute. Faisal's composure shattered. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, stepping back, face pale and sweating. But the damage was done. Security officers were already moving toward him at Khalid's silent signal. Investors whispered in outrage. Engineers stared at him with betrayal etched into their faces. Mira stood still, steady, unshaken. The trap had closed precisely as she intended, not through confrontation, but through strategy. She had allowed Faisal's ego to maneuver him into exposing himself, turning his desperation into the very evidence that destroyed him. As the guards escorted him out, his furious glare met hers for a final second, but this time it held no power. The room didn't see her as a child anymore. They saw her as the one person who could decode truth from chaos. And standing in the center of the arena, Mira felt a quiet strength settle in her chest, something she never expected to feel in this lifetime. Victory earned through brilliance, not mercy. The silence that followed Faisal's removal was unlike the silence that had greeted Mira when she entered the room hours earlier. This silence was charged, respectful, contemplative, edged with the disbelief of people realizing they had just witnessed the impossible. Mira remained standing near the projection table, her palms resting on the smooth glass surface, breath steadying as the last echoes of the commotion faded. Then, slowly, one of the senior engineers, grey-haired, stern, and notorious for never praising anyone, rose from his seat and walked toward her. He studied the live diagnostic feed still shimmering in the air, then looked at Mira with an expression that blended awe with reluctant admiration. "Your analysis," he said quietly, "was flawless." A second engineer nodded, then another. Within moments, the tone of the entire room shifted. Heads bowed to her, voices softened, doubt dissolved. Khalid stepped forward, not rushing, not forcing attention, but commanding it effortlessly. He stopped beside Mira and addressed the board with the calm certainty of a man who had already foreseen this moment. "Her discovery," he said, "did what weeks of conventional thinking failed to achieve." His gaze drifted briefly toward the door, where Faisal had been escorted out, then returned to the table. "This company prides itself on innovation, yet today, innovation came from someone none of you expected." Mira felt her chest rise with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The projection behind them flickered as Khalid executed the override patch she had programmed, her patch, and the device simulation ran clean for the first time since the project began. No errors, no alarms, no malfunctions. The room erupted into murmurs of stunned relief. Investors exchanged triumphant looks, and engineers scrambled to review her methodology. Then something extraordinary happened. Khalid turned fully toward Mira, not as a billionaire addressing a technician, not as a powerful figure acknowledging a subordinate, but as someone recognizing an equal. "Your work," he said, voice low enough that only she and the front row could fully hear, "has saved this launch. It was not flattery, it was truth, delivered with precision. He extended a hand toward her, an unspoken acknowledgement of a partnership earned through intellect, not circumstance. Mira looked at his hand for a heartbeat before placing her own in it. The room applauded, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. And in that moment, the humiliation she suffered in the marketplace felt like a distant memory, swallowed by the overwhelming realization that she had risen not just above her accusers, but far beyond the limits the world tried to place on her. She had won, brilliantly, undeniably, irrevocably. When Mira stepped out of the towering glass building that evening, the city around her felt different, not because the streets had changed, but because she had. The same sun-baked sidewalks that once felt heavy beneath her feet now seemed to stretch open like a path she had never noticed before. She clutched a small envelope Khalid's assistant had handed her after the meeting, her first payment. Enough to clear their rent for months, enough to put food in the kitchen, enough to pay every overdue school fee, enough to let her breathe. As she walked through the quiet alleys leading home, people brushed past, without noticing her, but for the first time, she didn't mind. She no longer needed validation from strangers. She had earned something far more powerful, the knowledge of her own value. When she reached her building, a faded structure wedged between two construction sites, she paused before climbing the stairs. The scent of spices drifted from a nearby food cart, mixing with the familiar dust of the neighborhood. Her home had never looked smaller, yet it had never felt more meaningful. Inside, her mother was sitting on the edge of the bed, sewing a torn sleeve for her brother's uniform by the light of a flickering lamp. When she looked up and saw Mira standing in the doorway, something in her daughter's posture made her set the fabric aside. Mira didn't say anything at first. She simply walked to the table, placed the envelope down, and gently slid it toward her mother. The moment her mother opened it, her hands flew to her mouth, eyes widening with disbelief. "Mira, ow," she whispered, voice trembling. Mira didn't tell her everything, just enough to ease her worry. "I fixed something important," she said softly, "and someone finally noticed." Later that night, when her brother fell asleep and her mother rested with tearful relief softening her face, Mira stepped out onto the building's rooftop alone. The warm breeze brushed against her skin as she looked at the glowing skyline, those distant towers she once admired like unreachable constellations. Now she didn't see them as places she didn't belong. She saw them as places she could reach. She felt no shame, no fear, no doubt, only a quiet certainty spreading through her chest, anchoring her to her new reality. She had walked into a world designed to exclude her, and she had walked out stronger, not because someone saved her, but because she rose when she was pushed down. And somewhere at the top of one of those gleaming towers she knew, Khalid al-Rami had taken note of that. Transformation just as clearly as she had. Late that same night, long after the boardroom lights had dimmed and the executives had gone home, Khalid remained alone in his office. The skyline stretched before him in shimmering gold, but his eyes were unfocused, lost somewhere far beyond the towers. On the table beside him lay a single device, one of the malfunctioning prototypes, its diagnostic light pulsing softly in the dark. But he wasn't looking at the device. He was looking at a small security feed paused on the screen. Mira, standing in the rooftop breeze of her building, the city lights reflecting in her eyes with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph. He hadn't meant to linger on that clip. He didn't usually observe people beyond what was necessary, yet something about the image held him still, pierced through the armor he'd built over years of ruthlessness. For a long moment, he let the silence wrap around him, and memories he had buried deep began to surface. Memories of a different life, before titles and expectations hardened him into a man others feared. He remembered being a boy in a sprawling house that felt cold despite its wealth, watching his father tear apart employees with a single sentence, watching his mother slip into the background until she became almost invisible. He remembered what it felt like to speak and not be heard, to exist and not be seen. The world had never rewarded vulnerability in his family. Power was the only language anyone understood. and so he had learned to speak it fluently, mercilessly, until the softer pieces of him shrank so small he barely recognized they were still there. Yet when he watched Mira, small, determined, rising despite humiliation, something inside him cracked open just enough for breath to slip through. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb against the edge of the prototype. "You remind me," he murmured, unfinished words dissolving into the stillness. But the memory of what she reminded him of who he used to be, of the boy he had abandoned to become the man he was, hung heavy in the room. For the first time in years, he felt something uncomfortable, something he didn't know what to do with. Remorse, not for destroying competitors or firing careless employees, but for the girl he had allowed to be dragged through the marketplace, judged, humiliated, while he stood and watched. He closed his eyes briefly, acknowledging the truth he had avoided all day. Mira had earned her place through brilliance, but he owed her more than opportunity. He owed her respect. And maybe, in some quiet corner of his guarded soul, he owed her gratitude for reminding him he still had a human heart. The following morning, Mira returned to the Al-Rami Technologies Tower, expecting another day of analysis, another round of system scans, another set of complex diagnostics. But when she stepped into the lobby, the receptionist straightened hurriedly and informed her that Khalid wanted to see her immediately. Not in the lab, not in the conference room, in his private office. Her heartbeat quickened, not with fear this time, but with a strange sense of gravity, as though she was stepping into a moment that would define everything that came after. She rode the elevator to the top floor, the city shrinking beneath her until it looked almost peaceful. When the doors opened, Khalid was already waiting, standing beside a broad desk made of polished black stone that reflected the morning light like water. He didn't begin with small talk, nor with the cold distance he usually maintained. Instead, he gestured for her to sit and placed a folder on the table between them. "This," he said calmly, "is a formal contract, a permanent position under my direct supervision. You'll continue your work on diagnostics and early prototype testing. Compensation will be significant." Mira opened the folder with careful fingers. Significant was an understatement. The salary, the benefits, the educational opportunities, it was more than she had ever dared to imagine. Her breath caught. It felt surreal, impossible, transformative. She closed the folder slowly and lifted her eyes to his. "Why are you offering me this?" she asked quietly. Khalid hesitated, just for a second, but long enough for her to see that beneath the polished exterior, something real flickered. Then she did something neither of them expected. She said, "I'll accept, but only if you agree to one condition." The room held its breath. Khalid's expression shifted, surprise touching his features, interest sharpening his gaze. "Name it," he said. Mira inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her truth settle into her spine. "I don't want the children in my neighborhood to grow up thinking they're invisible," she said. "They're smart, they're capable, they just don't have chances." She leaned in slightly. "So if I'm going to work for you, I want you to fund a small community tech center. Nothing extravagant, just a place with computers, tools, and maybe classes. A place where kids like me can learn what I had to learn alone." For several seconds, Khalid said nothing, not because he was displeased, but because the request landed somewhere he didn't expect, somewhere that struck deeper than business, deeper than obligation. He had anticipated negotiations about salary, hours, responsibilities, but this was different. This was purpose, this was impact, this was a challenge wrapped in sincerity. He studied Mira, seeing the steady conviction in her eyes, the quiet fire that had carried her out of poverty and into the heart of his empire, and something within him, something buried for years, stirred. Finally, he nodded once, decisively. "I'll build it," he said. "Not a small center, a full facility, equipped with everything you and your community need." His voice softened just slightly. "Consider it an investment in potential I never looked for before." Mira exhaled, relief blooming across her face. This was the condition she had dreamed of asking for, one that didn't uplift only her, but everyone she grew up with. Weeks later, the community center stood at the heart of Mira's neighborhood, a sleek, glass-walled building that glowed softly in the evening light, a beacon in a place that had long been overlooked. Children filled the rooms, with laughter and curiosity, their hands hovering over keyboards, circuits and tablets as instructors guided them through lessons Mira herself had once struggled to learn alone. Mothers gathered by the entrance, whispering in disbelief that someone had finally invested in their children. And every time Mira walked through those doors, she felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest, an affirmation that she had not only changed her own destiny, but also widened the path for others to follow. As she stepped onto the rooftop once again, looking out over the city that had once felt unreachable, Mira realized how profoundly different her life had become. She was no longer the girl who had been dragged across a marketplace floor, no longer the invisible student trying to keep her family afloat, no longer the underestimated technician working with scraps. She had become someone who commanded rooms filled with experts, someone whose brilliance shifted the future of an entire corporation, someone whose voice had built opportunities where none existed. The skyline no longer intimidated her, it invited her, and she understood now that power didn't come from money or status. It came from refusing to stay silent when the world tried to shrink you. Far above the city, in his office of quiet glass and steel, Khalid al-Rami watched from a distance as the lights of the community center flickered on. His expression was unreadable, but not cold. A man once, hardened by legacy, softened by the unexpected courage of a girl who refused to be small. He closed his eyes briefly, acknowledging a truth he had long ignored, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in control, but in recognizing the potential in someone who has none of the advantages you did. Mira had changed him, not by demanding power, but by reminding him of the humanity he had buried beneath it. And as the night settled over Dubai, Mira whispered to herself a question she hoped others would ask too, a question that echoed her journey and invited reflection. How many lives change forever because one person finally decided to see what was always there? Months later, the echoes of Mira's rise spread far beyond the narrow alleys where her journey began. Teachers from across the district visited the new tech center, astonished at the level of talent blooming inside its glass walls. Reporters wrote quiet articles about a mysterious donor, never knowing that the inspiration behind the project was a girl they would have overlooked on any ordinary day. Sometimes, strangers asked Mira for help with broken devices or difficult problems, unaware they were speaking to the mind that had saved a billion-dollar launch. And Mira helped every single one, because she still remembered how it felt to be dismissed before she ever had the chance to try. Her life changed, yes, but not in the way stories usually portray change. She didn't become arrogant or unreachable or distant from her community. Instead, the transformation felt like a widening circle. With every skill she gained, every opportunity she embraced, she made space for others to grow beside her. She still took the same walk home, still greeted the same neighbors, still studied late into the night with the same quiet determination. Only now, when she looked at her reflection in the window of a passing bus or a shop front, she recognized someone she had long dreamed of becoming, a version of herself that never surrendered to fear or humiliation. And somewhere across the city, in a high-rise office illuminated by quiet blue lights, Khalid al-Rami watched the results of the community center's first assessments. Dozens of children showed unexpected aptitude in coding, robotics, and engineering, potential that would have been lost forever. He ran his thumb along the edge of the reports and felt a faint, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He didn't take credit. He didn't make public statements. He simply allowed the center to grow, adding resources, upgrading equipment, and approving Mira's recommendations without hesitation. In his own way, cold, precise, but undeniably sincere, he supported her mission. And perhaps, without fully admitting it, he hoped she had found a piece of the hope he once lost. Because sometimes a single moment, a humiliation, a revelation, a spark of unexpected courage does more than change one life. Sometimes it sends a quiet ripple through the world, one that never truly ends.